I'll be saying hello to YouTube and Twitch, and hello to the Tiki Taki, and as always on Discord. And of course, I have to cough as soon as I start. How is everyone? Is everyone doing well? You know what? I'm going to try and find something here. So there's something a little bit in the background. So there's not complete silence in the background. And continued from yesterday, we have our goal of 150 because, financials are shit right now. So if you could help in any way, please do. And share this out to your friends. I see that there are 95 shares. Thank you so much. And thank you for the tippity tap so far. Yeah, let's get into it. Thank you so much, my love. So, where we stopped last week was where Orientalism, in its proper context, had to be in stark contrast to Occidentalism. And we have, even in the names of the work that we have, such as the Great British Experiment in Egypt, Protectorates and Mandates, there was that essence of mysticism, but then mysticism about knowledge in general. Spoken as they are out of the depths of European culture by writers who actually believe themselves to be speaking on behalf of that culture, such commonplaces cannot be simply explained as examples of provincial chauvinism. And chauvinism is not necessarily to do with the patriarchy, but chauvinism is about this kind of hero saving the people that they're talking about. This kind of benevolent idea of colonialism. They are not that, and as will be evident to anyone who knows anything about Foch and Baldensberger's work and other work, are more paradoxical for not being that. Their background is the transformation of the exacting professional science of Orientalism, whose function in the 19th century culture had been the restoration to Europe of a lost portion of humanity, but which had become in the 20th both an instrument of policy and, more important, a code by which Europe could interpret itself and the Orient to itself. So while they were going into what they called the Middle East, what we should be calling West Asia, and while they were making their way east into what they called the Orient in order to dominate and extract resources, the writing about it was that this is for king and country. This is for expanding our knowledge, expanding our understanding of the world, expanding our empire, expanding into these places that hold so much of our history, like the Levant, which holds the history of Christianity. But by the 20th century, it became a matter of policy. It became a matter of looking at the Orient as as not just opposite to the Occident, the West, but in terms of cementing a narrative that Europe was superior, Europe was superior and therefore deserved to own these lands and their resources. And also, taking resources from them required a justification, saying these people don't use their resources because they are uneducated, and so forth. For reasons discussed earlier in this book, modern Orientalism already carried within itself the imprint of the great European fear of Islam, and was aggravated by the political challenges of the entre-deux guerres, the wars. My point is that the metamorphosis of a relatively innocuous philological subspeciality into a capacity for managing political movements, administering colonies, making near apocalyptic statements, representing the white man's difficult civilizing mission, and thank you so much for being here. They're looking at their mission into the Orient as civilizing, because of course the native was not civilized. All this is something at work within a purportedly liberal culture, full of concern for its vaunted norms of Catholicity, plurality, and open-mindedness. Meanwhile, they were not open-minded. They were imposing their worldview onto people who didn't want it. In fact, what took place was the opposite of liberal, the hardening of doctrine and meaning imparted by quote-unquote science into quote-unquote truth. For if such truth reserved for itself the right to judge the Orient as immutably Oriental in the ways I've indicated, then liberality was no more than a form of oppression and mentalistic prejudice. 100%. Because they were looking at it as a civilizing mission. Meanwhile, it was a mission of colonization. The extent of such illiberality, was not and is not often recognized from within the culture. This is water. For reasons that this book is trying to explore, it is heartening, nevertheless, that such illiberality has occasionally been challenged. And now this is why when we're getting into part 3. Here's an instance from I.A. Richard's foreword to his Menicius on the Mind of 1932. We can quite easily substitute Oriental for Chinese in what follows. As to the effects of an increased knowledge of Chinese thought upon the West, it is interesting to notice that a writer so unlikely to be thought either ignorant or careless, Monsieur Etienne Gilson, can yet, in the English preface of the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, speak of Thomistic philosophy as accepting and gathering the whole of human tradition. This is how we all think. To us, the Western world is still the world, or part of the world that counts. But an impartial observer would perhaps say that such provincialism is dangerous, and we are not yet so happy in the West that we can be sure that we are not suffering from its effects. And here, yes, his focus is still on the West, but he's talking about how this particular idea of Orientalism, especially when applied to China, is entrapping European minds into this idea of superiority, which is not true. Richard's argument advances claims for the exercise of what he calls multiple definition, a genuine type of pluralism, with the combativeness of systems of definition eliminated. Because one thing is something, it doesn't mean another thing isn't that thing. Whether or not we accept his counter to Gilson's provincialism, we can accept the proposition that liberal humanism, of which Orientalism has historically been one department, retards the process of enlarging meaning, through which understanding can be attained. We took the place of enlarged meaning in the 20th century Orientalism, that is, within the technical field, and is the subject most immediately at hand. And in halting that kind of thinking into, hey, maybe two things can be true at the same time, it handicaps whatever knowledge that is being brought to the front. All right, and that is part 2. Now we get to part 3. And we are still on chapter 3. Yes, there are only 3 chapters in the book. And this is Orientalism Now. And we have quite a bit to get through. Obviously, I'm not going to get through the whole of part 3 today, but we have from page 255 to 328. That is part 3 of chapter 3. And here we get to modern Anglo-French Orientalism in its fullest flower. Because we have become accustomed to think of a contemporary expert of some branch of the Orient or some aspect of its life as a specialist in quote-unquote area studies, we have lost a vivid sense of how, until around World War II, the Orientalist was considered to be a generalist with a great deal of specific knowledge, who had highly developed skills for making summational statements. By summational statements, I mean that in formulating a relatively uncomplicated idea, say about Arabic grammar or Indian religion, the Orientalist would be understood and would understand himself as making a statement about the Orient as a whole. So, generalizations. Thereby summing it up. Thus, every discrete study of one bit of Oriental material would also confirm in summary way the profound Orientality of the material as a whole. And since it was commonly believed that the whole Orient hung together in some profoundly organic way, it made perfectly good hermeneutical sense for the Orientalist scholar to regard the material evidence he dealt with as ultimately leading to a better understanding of such things as the Oriental character, mind, ethos, or what we call the world spirit. And that kind of broad understanding says nothing about the culture in which the Orientalist lived. Most of the first 2 chapters of this book have made similar arguments about the earlier periods in the history of Orientalist thought. The differentiation in later history that concerns us here, however, is the one between the periods immediately before and after World War I. In both instances, as with earlier periods, the Orient is Oriental no matter the specific case and the style or technique used to describe it. The difference between the 2 periods in question is the reason given by the Orientalist for seeing the essential Orientality of it. A good example of the pre-war rationale can be found in the following passage by Herr Grange, taken from his 1899 review of Saho's Mohammedan or Mohammedanicht Recht. He says, "The law in which the practice had to make ever greater concessions to the use and customs of the people, and the arbitrariness of their rules, nevertheless retained a considerable influence on the intellectual life of Muslims. Therefore it remains, and still is for us too, an important subject of study, not only for abstract reasons connected with the history of law, civilization, and religion, but also for practical purposes. The more intimate the relations of Europe with the Muslim East become, the more Muslim countries fall under European suzerainty, and the more important it is for us Europeans to become acquainted with the intellectual life, religious law, and conceptual background of Islam." Islam has always been pitted against Christianity, because unlike Judaism, which rejects the idea of the Messiah, Islam says no, Jesus Christ is not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. But it has always been pitted against each other. And the fact that the majority of the Muslim people are brown has not been ignored in this. It's not just about the fact that Islam rejects Jesus Christ as the Messiah and exalts Muhammad, peace be upon him, as the prophet of God. That outright rejection and obviously the acceptance of Jesus or Isa as a prophet, is something that Christians always took offense to. Although this allows something so abstract as Islamic law did occasionally yield to the pressure of history and society, He is more interested than not in retaining the abstraction for intellectual use because of its broad outline. Islamic law confirms the disparity between East and West. For Grange, the distinction between Orient and Occident was no mere academic or popular cliché, quite the contrary. For him, it signified the essential, his historical power relationship between the two. Knowledge of the Orient either proves, enhances, or deepens the difference by which European suzerainty, the phrase has a venerable 19th century pedigree, is extended effectively over Asia. To know the Orient as a whole, then, is to know it because it is entrusted to one's keeping, even if one is a Westerner. An almost symmetrical passage to this is to be found in the concluding paragraph of Gibbs' article, Literature in the Legacy of Islam, published in 1931. After having described the three usual contacts between East and West up until the 18th century, Gibbs then proceeds to the 19th. Following on these three moments of casual contact, the German Romantics turned again to the East, and for the first time made it their conscious aim to open a way for a real heritage of Oriental poetry to enter into the poetry of Europe. The 19th century, with its new sense of power and superiority, seemed to clang the gate decisively in the face of their design. Today, on the other hand, there are signs of change. Oriental literature has begun to be studied again for its own sake, and new understanding of the East has been gained. As this knowledge spreads and the East recovers its rightful place in the life of humanity, Oriental literature may once again perform its historic function and assist us to liberate ourselves from the narrow and oppressive conceptions which would limit all that is significant in literature, thought, and history to our own segment of the globe. Which is really important because historical Orientalists were not studying Oriental poetry to study Oriental poetry. They were studying it to prove that European poetry was better. Gibbs' phrase, for its own sake, is in diametrical opposition to the string of reasons subordinated to Grange's declaration about European suzerainty over the East. What remains, nevertheless, is an inviolable all-over identity of something called the East and something else called the West. Such entities have a use for each other, and it is plainly Gibbs' laudable intention to show that the influence on Western of Oriental literature needs not be, in its results, what has been called a national disgrace. Rather, the East could be confronted as a sort of humanistic challenge to the local confines of Western ethnocentricity. And in examining Western ethnocentricity, understanding that Western ethnocentricity is at the center of how Oriental poetry, Oriental literature, Oriental knowledge is viewed. When people hear that they are studying Arabic numbering, the offense that is taken is like, why? So what? Math was invented in what you call the Middle East. So the power of zero was conceptualized in India. So why is it so offensive that part of your quote-unquote Western knowledge is influenced by brown people? You need to ask yourselves. His earlier solicitation of Goethe's idea of Weltliteratur notwithstanding, Gibbs' call for humanistic interanimation between East and West reflects the changed political and cultural realities of the post-war era. European suzerainty of the Orient had not passed, but evolved, in British Egypt, from more or less placid acceptance by the natives into a more and more contested political issue, combined and compounded by fractious native demands for independence. I mean, if the Europeans were willing to grant certain German German regions, their sovereignty, or Prussian back then, their sovereignty, why could we not have our independence from the metropole? These were the years of constant British trouble with Zaghloul, the Waft Party, and the like. Moreover, since 1925, there had been a worldwide economic recession, and this too increased the sense of tension that Gibbs' prose reflects. But the specifically cultural message in what he says is the most compelling. Heed the Orient, he seems to be telling his reader, for its use to the Western mind in the struggle to overcome narrowness, oppressive specialization, and limited perspectives is absolutely important, is so vital to our knowledge. The ground had shifted considerably from Hergronge to Gibb, as had the priorities. No longer did it go without much controversy that Europe's domination over the Orient was almost a fact of nature, nor was it assumed that the Orient was in need of Western enlightenment. We honestly weren't. We didn't need Western knowledge. Look at my mud hut. What mattered during the interwar years was a cultural self-definition that transcended the provincial and xenophobic. For Gibb, the West has need of the Orient as something to be studied because it releases the spirit from sterile specialization, eases the affliction of excessive parochial and nationalistic self-centeredness, increases one's grasp of the really central issues in the study of culture. If the Orient appears more partner in this new rising dialectic of cultural self-consciousness, it is, first, because the Orient is more of a challenge now than it ever was before, and second, because the West was entering a relatively new phase of cultural crisis, caused in part by the diminishment of Western suzerainty over the rest of the world. Therefore, in the best Orientalist work done during the interwar period, represented the impressive careers of Massignon and Gibb himself, and we will find elements in common with the best humanistic scholarship of the period. Thus, the summational attitude of which I spoke earlier can be regarded as the Orientalist equivalent of attempts in the purely Western humanities to understand culture as a whole, anti-positivistically, intuitively, sympathetically. And this move within Europe had to be extended to the colonies, essentially. Both the Orientalist and non-Orientalist begin with the sense that Western culture is passing through an important phase, whose main feature is the crisis imposed on it by threats as barbarism, narrow technical concerns, moral aridity, strident nationalism, and so forth. When we see nationalism on that scale rise out of a country in Europe, we say, hang on, that's bad. But when we see it from Europe in another country, such as South Africa, that we saw Afrikaner nationalism here, it was, oh, but that's natural. That's the natural state of things. We have to ask ourselves why. The idea of using specific texts, for instance, to work from specific to general, to understand the whole life period and consequently of a culture, is common to those humanists in the West, inspired by the work of Willem Dilthey, as well as to towering Orientalist scholars like Massignon and Gibb. The project of revitalizing philology, as it is found in the work of Curtius, Vossler, Aubach, Spitzer, Gundolf, Hofmannsthal, has its counterpart, therefore, in the invigorations provided to strictly technical Orientalist philology by Massignon's study of what he called the mystical lexicon, the vocabulary of Islamic devotion, and so on. I have to tell you, the Quran is one of the most difficult texts I have ever read in my life. The reason being is because not because the morality described in it is difficult to understand or antithetical to what we have learnt throughout our lives, because it's pretty much the same. It is an Abrahamic religion, after all. The reason the Quran is difficult to get through is because it is poetry. It is gorgeous, gorgeous poetry that is written in a way that you have to look deeper into into pretty much every line that you are reading. And now you have to look at it as the Quran was not revealed as a single book like the Bible. It was revealed over approximately 20 or so years. I think it's 23. And different passages responds to different events, questions that came up, crises that came up, treaties, battles, and conversations with early Muslim communities. And all of these revelations were compiled into the Quran, but not in chronological order. And number two, it assumes that the audience knows the context, because it was revealed as speech from Muhammad, peace be upon him. And everybody at the time knew who those certain people were, what event was being referenced, what question had been asked, and what verse had been revealed. So people look at the Quran not as a text in its entirety, cover to cover sometimes, but in its 7th century Arabic, they're looking for things like God's attributes, stories of the earlier prophets like the Prophet Isa, Jesus, legal guidance, reflections on nature, warnings, verses for comfort. And in that 7th century Arabic, majority of the power of the Quran comes from its rhythm, the way the Arabic sounds, the wordplay involved in the poetry, the repetition of certain words, the rhetorical questions and how they are phrased. And every now and then, from surah to surah, it has subtle shifts in perspective. And a lot of the time, the 7th century Arabic did not translate well into other languages. Reading the Quran is not just reading, it is experiencing a text. And that is the nature of West Asian poetry, is that you experience it because it is oral. It has to be recited aloud in Arabic. And the English Quran has been mistranslated in many cases because they were translated by Orientalists. And so it has been mistranslated as fear of God, piety at all costs, reverence in the face of the patriarch. But the Quran constantly asks the reader to reflect on one question that is recurring throughout the text. Will they not reflect? So rather than presenting arguments in a philosophical way, in a linear manner, it invites contemplation through these recurring themes. And it's done through stories and through imagery. And it's a feature, it's not a bug. This text, that question is meant to be returned to repeatedly, with new insights emerging every single time you read it. And you have to understand that classic Arabic is very, very, very dense. Quranic Arabic differs significantly from contemporary Arabic. And so somebody did tell me, and this is what I was searching for, this email, my friend Zaida, who actually called me yesterday, she said, imagine if someone took Psalms, Proverbs, parts of Isaiah, the Sermon on the Mount, legal sections from Deuteronomy, apocalyptic visions, and philosophical reflections, mix them together in a deliberate literary arrangement, and expected readers to meditate on them over a lifetime rather than read it cover to cover once. That is how the Quran functions. And how modern Muslims approach it is by looking for reliable translations, what is called the tafsir, or the commentary on the Quran, more knowledge of historical context, and sometimes an imam or mulana, or a knowledgeable teacher who has read and understood the Quran, has learned from generations before, and understanding the practice that goes with it, that has been built up over centuries. That is how people today should approach reading the Quran. And I was disoriented the first time I read it. So I had to break it up into short passages, reading it slowly, read a whole lot beside it. I had audio commentary going, and you do not power through the Quran from beginning to end. Just as you don't power through any Islamic text from beginning to end. So these Orientalists, they took work from the East, and they said, we're going to put it into a completely Western context, read it from beginning to end, and then try to make sense of it. And I've been meaning to write a piece called In Defense of Islam, an atheist defense of Islam. So my throat is getting scratchy again, so I'm going to stop as soon as we actually reached a perfect place to stop. So yeah, this mystical lexicon, or the vocabulary of Islam, is not actually mystical at all. It's just, it needs to be read in a different way. It needs to be perceived in a different way. It needs to be understood in a different way, just as every single bit of literature outside the West needs to be understood. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye to Twitch and YouTube. See you tomorrow.